The dust clung to Jedediah Stone like a second skin, a fine red powder that tasted of iron and finality. He lay flat on the sun-baked mesa, the stock of his Winchester a familiar weight against his cheek. Below, the trail snaked through a gut of fractured rock and skeletal cholla, a kill zone by any name. His target wasn't the trail itself, but the man who would soon ride it, Silas Croft, a man whose name was scrawled on a bounty notice, folded in Yet's saddlebag, the paper softened by sweat and distance. The price was enough to clear a debt that had shadowed him for 3 hard years. He wasn't a lawman, just a man who knew how to read terrain and the darker parts of the human heart. His gaze swept the far ridge, tracking the heat shimmer. Patience was a currency, and Jed was a wealthy man. He tracked the slow crawl of a vulture's shadow across the canyon floor, a living sundial marking the passage of a lethal afternoon. Then, a new dust signature, thicker than a lone rider. A stagecoach, careening down the switchbacks at a fool's pace, its driver lashing the team with a desperate rhythm. Yet's jaw tightened. Trouble. It wasn't his business. But Croft's territory was a web, and any disturbance could send the spider scurrying. He watched through his spyglass, the brass warm in his hand. Riders boiled out from a rock formation ahead of the coach, cutting it off. 6 of them, moving with the brutal efficiency of wolves. Gunfire popped, thin and sharp in the vast emptiness. One of the coach's outriders spun from his saddle, a limp sack of bones before he even hit the ground. The driver slumped over the reins. The coach slewed sideways, a wounded beast brought to its knees. Jed cursed under his breath. This wasn't a simple robbery. It was an execution. He could stay put, let it play out, and wait for Croft. That was the smart play, the one that got him paid. But the debt that haunted him wasn't just measured in dollars. It was paid in blood and regret, a marker called in from a time he'd failed to act. He slid the spyglass into its leather case. The smart play was for men with nothing to prove. Jed rose into a crouch, the Winchester becoming an extension of his will. He plotted his descent, a path of scree and shadow that only a goat or a ghost would take. Every footfall was silent, every shift in weight deliberate. He moved not like a man imposing himself on the landscape, but like a part of it, another jagged stone brought to life by a singular, deadly purpose. Below, the bandits had surrounded the coach. They weren't looting it. They were trying to pry the door open, their shouts echoing up the canyon walls. A single pistol shot cracked from inside. Defiance. Jed settled behind a granite outcrop, 100 yards above the scene. He sighted on the man at the coach door, a big brute using his rifle butt as a hammer. Jed exhaled, emptying his lungs, finding the still point at the heart of the world. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was a hammer blow, instantly answered by the solid thud of lid meeting flesh. The big man collapsed. The world below erupted. The 5 remaining riders scattered for cover, their surprise a tangible thing. They fired wildly at the cliffs, bullets whining off rock with angry sparks. Jed worked the Winchester's lever, the slick, metallic sound a grim comfort. He wasn't looking for a firefight. He was looking for an advantage. He fired again, not at a man, but at a loose rock pillar above 2 of the bandits. The heavy slug struck home, and a ton of weathered sandstone disintegrated, crashing down in a choking avalanche of dust and stone. 2 riders vanished under the slide. 3 left. Jed shifted position, sliding down a steep gravel slope, using the noise of the rock slide to cover his movement. He landed in a crouch behind the wrecked coach, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and panicked horses. The door creaked open. A woman's face, smudged with dirt, framed by dark, unbound hair. A Colt Peacemaker was held steady in her 2 hands, its barrel unwavering. Her eyes, a startling shade of gray, held no fear, only a cold, furious appraisal. "Who in God's name are you?" she asked, her voice low and steady. "The man who just ruined their afternoon," Jed replied, his gaze already scanning the rocks for the remaining threats. "Stay inside." "They killed my driver," she stated, a fact delivered without tremor. "I'm aware." A bullet tore a long splinter from the coach's roof, inches from his head. He dropped flat, pulling her down with him. "They're flanking us." She didn't flinch. "The one on the left has a scattergun. The other two are trying to get to the horses." Her tactical assessment was as sharp and immediate as his own. This was no wilting flower. Jed risked a look around the axle. She was right. The terrain offered them nothing but this broken box of wood for cover. Their options were dwindling with every passing second. "Can you shoot?" he asked, not turning. "I can." "Good. When I move, put a shot over the rocks to the right. Make them look that way." He didn't wait for an answer. He took a breath, then broke cover, sprinting low toward a cluster of boulders that offered a better angle. The peacemaker roared from the coach window, the sound sharp and close. As predicted, two heads popped up from the right, drawn by the sound. It was all the time Jed needed. The Winchester spoke twice, the lever a blur of motion in his hand. Two more bodies crumpled into the red dirt. The silence that followed was immense, broken only by the ragged breathing of the horses and the low moan of the wind. The last bandit, the one with the scattergun, was nowhere to be seen. Jed scanned the rocks, every nerve alight. A trap. A final desperate play. The woman emerged from the coach, reloading the Colt with practiced, efficient movements. "He's in the wash," she said, her eyes fixed on a dry creek bed 50 yards away. "He'll wait for us to move for the horses." Jed glanced at her, a flicker of surprise cutting through his focus. "How do you know?" "It's what I would do," she said, her voice flat. She met his gaze, and for a moment, Jed felt like he was the one being sized up. There was a story in those gray eyes, one written in powder and steel. He'd come here hunting a monster, and instead, he'd stumbled into someone else's war. They moved together, a practiced economy of motion that belied their status as strangers. Jed took the lead, rifle held at a low ready, while the woman, who called herself Lena, covered their rear, the big Colt sweeping the rocks behind them. The dead lay where they had fallen, their stillness a stark counterpoint to the nervous energy of the surviving horses. The animals were tangled in their traces, eyes wide with terror. Calming them would take time they didn't have. "We take two," Jed said, his voice a low command. "Cut the rest loose. They'll draw attention if anyone's watching." Lena nodded, already pulling a knife from a sheath hidden in her boot. She moved toward the lead pair, her hands gentle but firm on the frantic animals, murmuring to them in a low tone. Jed watched the wash, his focus absolute. He could feel the scattergun out there, a palpable threat coiled in the shimmering heat. The silence was the worst part. A patient man was a dangerous man. He checked his own ammunition. 6 rounds in the Winchester, 4 in his Remington sidearm. Not enough, never enough. Lena worked quickly, her knife flashing as she sliced through the thick leather traces. 2 horses were free, their tack stripped to the essentials. She led them back toward the relative cover of the coach. "They were craftsmen," she said, not looking at him. Her voice was tight. "I saw his brand on the saddlebags." Yet's got tightened. So his bounty was involved. This wasn't a random raid. It was a targeted strike. What did they want? "What men like that always want," she replied, her answer a wall. There was a strong box. Jed looked at the coach. The lock on the rear boot was smashed, the contents rifled through. But the heavy, iron-banded strong box itself was still bolted to the floor, its seal unbroken. They didn't get it. "You stopped them," she said, a simple statement of fact. She finished securing a canteen and a small bundle to one of the saddles. Her movements were spare and efficient, with no wasted energy. She knew the trail. She knew what was essential. "Croft won't let this go," Jed said, thinking aloud. "He'll send more." "He will," she agreed. "Which is why we need to be gone 10 minutes ago." She swung up into the saddle with a fluid grace that spoke of a life spent on horseback. She held the reins of the second horse, waiting for him. Her gaze was a challenge. He was the rescuer, but she was setting the pace. He took the reins, his eyes still fixed on the silent wash. The last man was a loose thread, a complication that could unravel everything. They couldn't ride out without knowing where he was. "I need to draw him out," Jed said. He pointed to a narrow gap in the rocks to the north. "Get to that pass. Wait for my signal. If you don't hear it by sundown, ride on." Lena looked from Jed to the pass, her expression unreadable. "What's the signal?" "3 quick shots." "And if I hear one?" she asked, her gray eyes locking onto his. The question hung in the air, sharp and brutal. "Then you ride faster," he said. She held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. She turned her horse and, leading the other, moved away at a steady walk, not a panicked bolt. She didn't look back. Jed watched her go, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He was now tied to her, his simple bounty hunt irrevocably complicated by a woman who seemed more capable than most men he knew. He turned his attention back to the wash. He was alone again, the silence his only companion. He unstrapped his bedroll and propped it up behind a rock, his hat perched on top. A classic decoy. Simple, but often effective against a man whose nerves were already frayed. Then he began to move, circling wide, using the sun at his back. The hunter was now the hunted, a game he knew all too well. The sun beat down, turning the canyon floor into a skillet. Jed moved with a liquid patience, a ghost in the shimmering heat. He found the tracks easily. A scuffed boot heel here, a dislodged pebble there. The man had crawled deeper into the wash, seeking a better ambush point. He was wounded, too. A small, dark smear on a patch of sand confirmed it. Jed had hit him with the rockfall. A wounded man was a desperate man, and desperation made a man predictable. Jed followed the signs, not directly, but in a parallel line along the rim of the wash, keeping to the high ground. He moved from boulder to boulder, a predator closing on its prey. The world narrowed to the hunt, to the faint sounds of the wind and the rasp of his own breathing. He found him holed up in a deep undercut bank, the twin barrels of a shotgun poking out from the shadows. The man was panting, his face pale with pain and fear. He was young, barely a man, with wide, terrified eyes. Jed could have ended it right there. A single shot from above. Clean, final. But the bounty on Croft was still his priority, and a live prisoner might talk. A dead one told no tales. He holstered his rifle and drew his Remington. He dislodged a small rock with his boot, sending it skittering down the bank. The shotgun barrels swiveled wildly toward the sound. "Drop it." Yet's voice was low and hard, echoing slightly in the confined space. The kid flinched, his head snapping up. He couldn't see Jed, who was hidden by the glare of the sun. "Show yourself," the kid yelled, his voice cracking. "Throw the shotgun out first, then your sidearm. Do it slow." There was a long, tense silence. Jed could hear the kid's ragged breathing. He was weighing his chances. They were 0. Jed fired a single shot into the dirt a foot from the shotgun barrels. The sand exploded. The next one won't miss. The shotgun slid out of the shadows, followed by a Colt pistol. A moment later, the kid emerged, his hands raised, one arm slick with blood. Jed slid down the bank, his own pistol steady. "On your face." The kid complied, his bravado gone, replaced by a raw, youthful fear. Jed kicked the weapons away, and bound the kid's hands with a leather thong from his belt. Why the attack? Jed asked, his voice calm. Was it the strongbox? The kid just shook his head, refusing to meet Yet's eyes. Croft wanted the woman, he finally mumbled into the dirt. Just the woman. Said she was a thief, that the box was his. A thief? Jed prodded. What did she steal? Don't know. Papers, maybe. He just said to bring her to him. Alive, if possible. Said the rest were expendable. Jed processed the information. It wasn't about the money. It was personal. Lena wasn't just a passenger caught in the crossfire. She was the target. The strongbox was a pretext. He looked at the kid, at the fear in his eyes. He wasn't a hardened killer. He was a hired hand in over his head. Croft will be at the old redemption mine, the kid whispered, a desperate plea for leniency. That's his base. He's waiting for her there. Redemption. Jed knew it. A played-out silver mine high in the Dragoon foothills. A natural fortress. Taking Croft, there would be suicide. He had what he needed. He looked up at the sun, gauging the time. It was getting late. He still had to signal Lene. He left the kid tied up, taking his water canteen. He'd send a rider from the next town, if the kid was lucky. He climbed out of the wash and fired 3 quick shots into the air, the sound rolling through the canyons. A promise kept. Then he mounted the second horse and rode north, not with the haste of a man fleeing, but with the steady, ground-eating pace of a man with a destination. The trail ahead was no longer just about a bounty. It was about a woman with secrets and a warlord who wanted her back at any cost. He caught up with her at dusk, silhouetted against a bruised purple sky at the mouth of the pass. She was waiting as promised, her rifle laid across her lap, her posture alert. She showed no relief at his arrival, only a quiet assessment. One man? She asked. One man, he confirmed, swinging down from the saddle. He talked. He relayed the kid's story. Croft's focus on her, the lie about the strongbox, the rendezvous at the redemption mine. She listened without interruption, her expression betraying nothing. The fire she'd built was small and smokeless, a testament to her skill. He wants the papers, she said, finally. It wasn't a question. What papers? A map, she said, her voice dropping lower. And a deed. They were in the strongbox. Jed stared at her. A map to what? Something worth more than a coach full of payrolls. She poked the fire with a stick, sending a shower of sparks into the growing darkness. My father found a silver lode in the Dragoons before he died. Croft was his partner. He muscled my father out, took the claim, and left him with nothing. The deed proves my ownership. The map shows the one pass into the valley that isn't on any surveyor's chart. Justice or revenge. Jed understood those motivations. They were cleaner than money, so you were deliberately drawing him out. I was, she admitted. This was supposed to be a trade, my crew for his. A show of force to bring him to the table. I didn't count on his men being so committed, and I didn't count on you. The words hung between them, an acknowledgment of the chaos he had introduced into her carefully laid plan. For the first time, Jed felt the full weight of his intervention. He had stumbled into the middle of a private war, a high-stakes game of inheritance and betrayal played out across the harsh frontier. They ate in silence, a shared meal of jerky and hardtack. The easy camaraderie of the trail was gone, replaced by a tense, unspoken negotiation. He was no longer her savior. He was a variable, a complication she hadn't accounted for. And she was no longer a victim. She was a player, with stakes far higher than he had imagined. Croft won't stop, Jed said, breaking the silence. He can't afford to let you walk away with that map. I know. He'll have the pass watched. The direct route to redemption is a death trap. There's another way, she said. The old smuggler's trail. Through the devil's jawbone. Jed knew the place by reputation. a treacherous maze of slot canyons and knife-edge ridges that even the Apache avoided. It was a place that killed the careless and the unlucky. "It's a 2-day ride," he said. "If the terrain doesn't kill us, dehydration will." "There's no water." "There is," she countered. "One spring, hidden in a box canyon. My father marked it on a corner of the map." She looked at him, her gray eyes reflecting the firelight. "I can't get there alone. I need a guide. Someone who can read the signs and watch our back. Croft will have trackers out. Good ones." The offer was clear. She wasn't asking for protection. She was proposing a partnership. A dangerous, desperate alliance against a common enemy. The bounty on Croft was still valid. But getting to him through the devil's jawbone was a long shot. And trusting this woman, this catalyst of violence and secrets, was an even bigger one. Yet, leaving her to face Croft alone felt like walking away from that old debt all over again. He looked from her resolute face to the dark, jagged silhouette of the mountains. "We ride at first light," he said. The devil's jawbone lived up to its name. It was a hostile, alien landscape of twisted rock, where the wind moaned like a lost soul, and the sun beat down with a malevolent intensity. They rode in silence, conserving their energy, their horses picking their way carefully over the treacherous ground. Jed led, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain, reading the subtle language of the land. A displaced stone, a fresh track, the nervous flight of a bird, nothing escaped his notice. Lena rode behind him, a silent, watchful presence. She had shed the last vestiges of the stagecoach passenger, and was now purely a creature of the frontier, tough, resilient, and utterly focused. At their first camp, a sheltered alcove barely big enough for two, the tension between them finally broke. As Jed checked the horse's hooves for stone bruises, Lena spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "You still don't trust me." Jed didn't stop his work. "Trust is earned on the trail. So far, you've earned my attention." "I didn't ask for your help," she reminded him. "You charged in, guns blazing." "I saw men about to kill a woman," he countered, finally looking up. The reasons didn't matter at the time. Do they matter now? The question was a challenge. He stood up, wiping his hands on his trousers. "They do. I'm riding into Silas Croft's private hell. I'd like to know who I'm riding with." Lena held his gaze, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of vulnerability beneath her iron resolve. "My name is Lena Navarro," she said. "My father was Mateo Navarro. He and Croft discovered the La Sombra lode together. My father was the geologist, the one who knew the rock. Croft was the money, the muscle. When the silver proved rich, Croft registered the claim in his name alone. He forged my father's signature on a bill of sale and ran him off with threats against me. My father died a broken man, trying to find a lawman who would listen. He left me the original deed and his private survey map. That's what's in the strongbox, my legacy, my justice." The story settled between them, stark and unadorned. It was a tale as old as the frontier itself, a story of greed, betrayal, and a debt that could only be paid in blood. "So the men you were with," Jed said, connecting the pieces, "they were your father's loyalists. Men who knew Croft for what he was." "They were," she confirmed, her voice tight with grief. "And now they're dead. Because my plan was flawed. Because I underestimated Croft. And because you showed up." The accusation was plain, but there was no heat in it, only a weary resignation. Jed felt a familiar pang of guilt. His impulsive act of heroism had cost lives. He had charged into a situation he didn't understand, and now he was living with the consequences. As he was about to speak, Lena held up a hand, her head cocked. "Listen." Jed went silent, straining his ears. At first, there was nothing but the wind. Then he heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound, almost lost in the gusts. Hoofbeats, distant but steady, and more than one rider. Trackers, he breathed. They found our trail. They looked at each other, the personal history and mistrust between them dissolving in the face of a shared, immediate threat. They're faster than I thought, Lena said, her hand instinctively going to the Colt at her hip. We need to lose them, Jed said, his mind already racing, calculating angles and terrain. Now, they moved with a desperate urgency, kicking out their fire and saddling the horses in the dark. There would be no more rest. The hunt was on. They rode through the night, a desperate, long-bursting flight through the labyrinth of canyons. The moon was a sliver, offering little light, forcing them to rely on their horses' instincts and Yet's uncanny sense of direction. He pushed them hard, taking risks he normally wouldn't, navigating by the stars and the feel of the ground beneath him. Behind them, the trackers were relentless. Every so often, they would see the faint, flickering light of a lantern far behind them, a malevolent yellow eye in the darkness. Croft's men knew this land, too. By dawn, they were exhausted, their horses lathered in sweat. They had found the box canyon Lena had described, a narrow slit in the rock face, hidden by a dense growth of mesquite. Inside, a trickle of clear, cold water seeped from the rock, pooling in a small basin. It was a miracle. As the horses drank their fill, Jed climbed to the canyon's rim to watch their back trail. He saw them within minutes. 4 riders moving at a steady pace, their leader pointing toward the ground. They hadn't lost them. They're still on us, he said, sliding back down into the canyon. We've bought an hour, maybe 2. Lena looked at the sheer rock walls surrounding them. It was a perfect sanctuary and a perfect trap. There's no other way out, she said. Then we don't go out, Jed replied, his eyes scanning the canyon. We go up. He pointed to a series of weathered ledges and fissures that climbed one side of the canyon wall. It'll be a hard climb. We'll have to leave the horses. Lena's face was grim. Leaving their horses was a death sentence if they didn't find shelter and water on the other side. But staying meant a certain fight against odds they couldn't beat. There's a line shack on the other side of this ridge, she said, pulling the map from her saddlebag. My father used it. It's marked here. She pointed to a small cross on the worn parchment. If we can get there, we can rest and make a new plan. It was a desperate gamble, but it was their only one. They filled their canteens, took the ammunition, jerky, and the precious strongbox, and released the horses, slapping their rumps to send them deeper into the canyon. It was a decoy, a ghost trail for Croft's men to follow. Then they began to climb. The rock was hot and unforgiving. Handhold by handhold, they clawed their way upward, the strongbox a dead weight on Yet's back. The sun beat down on them, and the trackers' voices echoed from the canyon floor below. Closer now. They were discovered. A shot rang out, the bullet smacking into the rock just feet from Lena's head, showering her with stone fragments. She cried out, not in pain, but in frustration and rage. They were exposed, pinned down on the cliff face. Jed looked up. 20 more feet to the ridge. They wouldn't make it. Below, the men were taking aim, settling in for a patient siege. He looked at Lena, clinging to the rock, her face set in a mask of grim determination. He saw the same trapped desperation he felt. Then his eyes fell on a large, precariously balanced rock formation just above them. An idea, born of pure, distilled desperation, took hold. Keep climbing, he yelled to Lena. Don't stop. He unslung his rifle, bracing himself precariously on a narrow ledge. He took aim, not at the men below, but at the base of the rock pillar. It was a shot he might make 1 time in 100. He took a breath, whispered a prayer to a god he wasn't sure he believed in, and fired. The Winchester's crack echoed like a thunderclap in the narrow canyon. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. The bullet whined off the rock base with a sharp ping. Jed levered another round, his knuckles white. Then a low groan, the sound of immense pressure shifting. A crack appeared at the base of the pillar. With a deafening roar, the entire formation gave way, a colossal finger of stone toppling down into the canyon. It didn't hit Croft's men directly, but it didn't have to. The impact shattered the canyon floor, triggering a massive rock slide. The air filled with a tidal wave of dust and screaming stone. The 4 trackers and their horses were simply swallowed by the earth, their shouts abruptly silenced. Jed and Lena flattened themselves against the cliff face as the shockwave hit them, the rock trembling beneath their hands. Dust, thick and acrid, oiled up, choking them. When the rumbling finally subsided, the canyon below was unrecognizable, a choked, impassable graveyard of rock. They had survived, but their escape route was gone, and the only way was forward. They finished the climb in a grim, dust-caked silence, their ears ringing. They collapsed on the ridge, lungs burning, limbs trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. The sun was setting, painting the jagged peaks in hues of blood and gold. They were alive, but they were afoot, in one of the most unforgiving territories in the West, with a ruthless enemy who now knew exactly where they were headed. The line shack Lena had mentioned was a dark smudge against a distant hill. It looked a lifetime away. They walked. The strong box, once a symbol of hope and justice, was now a leaden anchor. Jed shifted its weight on his shoulders, the leather straps digging into his raw skin. Every step was a battle. They didn't talk. There was nothing to say. The shared ordeal had forged a new kind of bond between them, a silent understanding built on instinct and survival. They were a team now, bound by blood and desperation. They reached the shack long after dark, guided by the cold light of the stars. It was a miserable hovel, little more than 4 decaying walls and a partially collapsed roof. But it was shelter. Inside, they found a rusty pump over a dry well and a few splintered crates. It was empty, abandoned. Lena sank onto one of the crates, her face buried in her hands. For the first time, Jed saw her formidable will begin to crack. The weight of her dead crew, the loss of her horses, the crushing reality of their situation. It was all closing in. "My father died for this," she whispered, her voice ragged. "For a box of paper and a pile of rocks." Jed dropped the strong box to the dirt floor with a heavy thud. He pried it open with the tip of his knife. Inside, nestled on a bed of old velvet, was a worn leather folio containing the deed and the map. He handed them to her. She took them, her fingers tracing the faded ink of her father's handwriting. "Croft won't be expecting us on foot," Jed said, his voice rough with thirst. "He'll think the rock slide finished us." "That gives us an edge? An edge?" She looked up, her gray eyes dark with despair. "We have no water, no food, and a 10-mile walk to the nearest sign of life. We're not on the edge, Jed. We're in the grave." Just then, a floorboard creaked under Yet's boot. It sounded hollow. He knelt down, running his hand over the dusty planks. He found the edge of a small, concealed hatch. He lifted it. Below, in the darkness of a small cellar, were canvas-wrapped parcels and 2 large, corked canteens. A smuggler's cache, or a survivor's stash. They found dried meat, a sack of cornmeal, and most importantly, water, 10 gallons of it. Mateo Navarro had prepared for this. He had known that one day someone might have to make this journey, this fight. He had left a lifeline for his daughter. Lena stared at the supplies, tears welling in her eyes, not of despair, but of a fierce, renewed hope. She looked at Jed, a silent message of gratitude passing between them. They weren't dead yet. They had a chance. And as they rationed out their first meal in over a day, a new plan began to form. A plan not of escape, but of attack. The Redemption Mine was less a fortress, and more a scar on the mountainside. A sprawling complex of headframes, shacks, and ore crushers clung to the steep slope. all under the watchful eye of armed guards on the perimeter. A direct assault was impossible, but Lena's map offered another way. Her father, a meticulous man, hadn't just charted the silver lode. He'd mapped the entire network of old, unstable prospecting tunnels that riddled the mountain like a worm-eaten apple. One of them, a narrow ventilation shaft, came up directly beneath the assay office, the very building where Croft lived and worked. It was their way in. They spent a full day observing the mine from a high, hidden vantage point, studying the guards' routines, the shift changes, the layout of the camp. Their plan was simple and suicidal. They would go in at night, during the midnight shift change when the camp was at its most chaotic. Jed would create a diversion on the east perimeter, a series of small, contained rock slides using the last of their blasting caps, scavenged from the line shack's cache. While the guards were drawn to the commotion, Lena would slip through the darkened camp to the assay office, enter through the ventilation shaft, and retrieve the strongbox, which they'd been forced to leave behind at the ambush site. They would meet at a prearranged point and disappear back into the mountains. It was a plan with 1,000 ways to fail. As darkness fell, a cold wind swept down from the peaks. They made their final preparations in silence, a ritual of checking weapons and equipment. Jed handed Lena his Remington. "It's quieter than the rifle," he said. "Use it only if you have to." She took the heavy pistol, its weight familiar in her hand. "What about you?" "I'll be loud enough for the both of us." He looked at her, his face grim in the moonlight. "Lena, if things go wrong—" "They won't," she cut him off, her voice firm. There was no room for doubt. "Not now." "We cross by dawn," she said, echoing a creed of the trail. "Or not at all." They separated, melting into the shadows. Jed moved with the patience of a hunter, circling wide to the east. He planted the blasting caps with practiced care, wedging them into cracks in the rock face overlooking the camp's mule pen. He timed it perfectly. As the midnight whistle blew for the shift change, he lit the fuses. The explosions were not massive, but they were terrifyingly loud in the night silence. Rock and debris rained down near the mule pen, and the animals erupted in a panicked braying, kicking down fences and scattering through the camp. It was chaos. Shouts and lanterns converged on the east side, just as he'd planned. Under the cover of the pandemonium, Lena moved like a phantom. She slipped between buildings, a fleeting shadow in the darkness, her knowledge of the mine's layout serving her well. She reached the assay office, a squat stone building set apart from the others. The trapdoor to the shaft was concealed beneath a stack of old ore sacks. She moved them silently and lifted the heavy wooden lid. The air that rose from the darkness below was cold and smelled of damp earth and stale gunpowder. She took a deep breath, holstered the Remington, and lowered herself into the shaft. The shaft was tight, the rock walls scraping against her shoulders. She descended the rickety iron ladder, each rung groaning in protest. The sounds of the commotion above faded, replaced by the dripping of water and the pounding of her own heart. She landed on the cellar floor, the darkness absolute. She struck a match, the sudden flare of light revealing a cramped space filled with geological survey equipment and dusty core samples. Her father's world. A wave of grief and resolve washed over her. There was a steep flight of wooden stairs leading up. She crept up them, the Remington now in her hand, the hammer cocked. The door at the top was unlocked. She eased it open a crack. The office was lit by a single oil lamp on a large oak desk. And sitting at the desk, cleaning a pistol, was Silas Croft. He wasn't panicked. He hadn't been drawn out by the diversion. He was waiting. "I knew you'd come, Lena," he said, not looking up from his work. He was a big man, with a stillness that was more menacing than any overt threat. "Your father was predictable, too. Always favored the back door." Lena stepped into the room, leveling the Remington at his chest. "It's over, Silas. The deed is filed in Prescott." The sheriff knows the whole story. This is just a formality. It was a bluff, a good one, but Croft just smiled. It was a cold, thin-lipped expression. The law doesn't reach this high up the mountain. Here, I am the law. He gestured with his pistol to a chair. Sit. We have business to discuss. Your partner is keeping my men busy, but not for long. Lena didn't move. There's nothing to discuss. Oh, I think there is, Croft said, his eyes finally lifting to meet hers. They were cold and flat, like a snake's. You have the map. I have the mine. A partnership seems the most logical solution. Your father's dream realized. You and I together. The offer was obscene, a vile twisting of her father's legacy. I'd rather see you in hell. Croft sighed, a sound of theatrical disappointment. A pity. He raised his pistol, but before he could fire, the window behind him shattered inward. Jed swung through, landing in a crouch, his Winchester already leveled. Croft's men hadn't been as distracted as he'd hoped. Jed had been forced to fight his way across the camp, a running gun battle in the shadows. He was bleeding from a graze on his arm, but his eyes were clear and focused. Drop it, Croft, Jed growled. For a moment, a tense tableau held the room. Croft caught between them, a wolf cornered by two hunters. Croft's smile widened. You think you've won? He didn't lower his gun. Instead, he reached over and turned up the wick on the oil lamp, flooding the room with bright light. You see, Pathfinder, you weren't the only one with a plan. He kicked a small lever on the floor next to his desk. With a low groan, a heavy iron grate slammed down over the doorway, trapping them. From concealed slits in the walls, the barrels of two rifles emerged, manned by men in the adjacent rooms. It was an ambush, a fortress within a fortress. The house always wins, Croft said, his voice dripping with triumph. He raised his pistol again, this time aiming directly at Jed. Now, about that map ... double quotes, Jed didn't hesitate. He didn't aim for Croft. He aimed for the oil lamp on the desk. The Winchester roared, and the lamp exploded, plunging the room into absolute darkness and spraying burning oil across the desk. Croft screamed as flames licked at his arm. The riflemen in the adjoining rooms fired blindly into the blackness, their shots tearing through the space where Jed and Lena had been standing. Jed had already tackled Lena, pulling her down behind the heavy oak desk as the first shots ripped through the air. Splinters rained down on them. The floor. Lena yelled over the gunfire, her voice tight with urgency. The shaft. In the flickering, chaotic light of the burning desk, they scrambled back toward the cellar door. Croft, batting at the flames on his sleeve, fired wildly into the darkness. A bullet tore through the fleshy part of Yet's thigh, the impact like a sledgehammer blow. He grunted in pain but didn't stop, pulling himself toward the opening. Lena was already in the shaft, reaching up for him. Jed, come on. He tumbled through the opening just as the burning desk collapsed, sending a shower of sparks and embers down after them. Above, Croft's enraged shouts were cut off as the fire took hold, the flames roaring as they consumed the dry wood and paper of the office. They were in the dark again, the smell of smoke filling the narrow tunnel. Jed gritted his teeth against the searing pain in his leg. We have to move. They'll come through the other tunnels. Lena tore a strip of cloth from her shirt and began to wrap his leg, her hands working quickly and surely in the darkness. Can you walk? I'll have to. Supported by Lena, he began to stumble through the labyrinthine tunnels, following the map that was now imprinted in her memory. Behind them, they could hear the shouts of Croft's men, their voices echoing through the interconnected shafts. It was a race now, a desperate flight through the guts of the mountain. They emerged from a side tunnel into a massive, cathedral-like cavern, the main chamber of the silver lode itself. Glistening veins of silver ran through the rock walls, glittering in the faint light from a high ventilation shaft. It was a king's ransom, a fortune that had cost so many lives. And waiting for them, at the far end of the cavern, by the main adit that led to the outside, were the last of Croft's men, their lanterns cutting through the gloom. They were trapped, but as the men advanced, a low, ominous groaning sound echoed from deep within the mine. The fire in the assay office, combined with the structural damage from Yet's earlier diversion, was taking its toll. The mountain was dying. Small rocks began to fall from the ceiling. A deep fissure cracked open across the cavern floor. "The whole thing is coming down," Lena yelled. Jed looked at the miner's hoist near the main adit, its heavy iron bucket hanging from a thick cable. He looked at the fissure, then at Lena. A final, desperate gamble. Get to the bucket. He roared and shoved her toward it. He gave her the strongbox. "If I fall, ride." Then he turned, raised his Winchester, and fired, not at the men, but at the rock above them, aiming for the key stress points he'd learned to spot over a lifetime of reading the land. It was his last stand, a final, defiant act to buy her time. The mountain screamed. Yet's shots, expertly placed, were the final straw. A huge section of the cavern roof gave way, crashing down in a deafening avalanche that cut off Croft's men, burying them under tons of rock. The entire mine shuddered, the ground heaving. The main adit collapsed, sealing the exit. Lena reached the hoist bucket, a heavy iron ore carrier, and looked back. Jed was down, his leg finally giving out, half buried in a fresh fall of rock and debris. The path back to him was gone. He was on the other side of a chasm that was widening by the second. "Jed!" she screamed, her voice lost in the roar of the dying mountain. He managed to push himself up on one arm, his face pale with pain and covered in dust. He looked at her, then pointed upward toward the hoist mechanism at the top of the shaft, 100 feet above them. He gave a sharp, definitive nod. Go. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. A release. Tears streaming down her face, Lena scrambled into the bucket. She found the brake lever for the hoist, its mechanism designed to lower the bucket, not raise it. But her father had shown her a trick. A way to disengage the clutch, to send it plummeting down to a lower level. With a cry of anguish, she threw the lever. The bucket didn't go up. It dropped. It fell into the darkness of the lower shaft, a stomach-lurching plunge into the unknown, just as the last of the cavern ceiling collapsed behind her, sealing the upper mine forever. She landed with a jarring crash in a flooded lower tunnel, the water instantly soaking her. She was alive. She was free. But Jed was gone, sacrificed. She sat in the darkness for a long time, the only sounds the dripping of water and her own ragged sobs. Finally, her resolve hardened. He hadn't died for her to give up. She found her way through the flooded tunnel, following the flow of water until she saw a faint glimmer of light. She emerged from a drainage outlet onto the side of the mountain, miles from the mine entrance, just as the sun was beginning to rise. She was bruised, battered, and alone. But in her hand, she clutched the strongbox. She had her father's legacy. She had won. The cost had been everything. 2 days later, Lena rode into Prescott. She filed the deed, presented her evidence to a federal marshal, and officially claimed what was hers. The story of the Redemption Mine collapse, a tragic accident that killed the notorious Silas Croft and his entire crew, became another frontier legend. But Lena knew the truth. Months passed. She used her newfound wealth to rebuild, not just the mine, but the lives of the families her crew had left behind. She was a leader now, respected and fair, a force for stability in a lawless land. But every evening, she would look to the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, a silent vigil for the man who had saved her. She never knew that Jedediah Stone had survived. Pinned by the rockfall, with a broken leg and bleeding out, he had been found by an old Apache prospector who had seen the smoke and come to investigate. The old man had nursed him back to health, setting his leg and teaching him the deeper secrets of the mountains. The recovery was long and painful. When he was finally able to ride again, he was changed. The debt that had driven him was paid, not in gold, but in sacrifice. He no longer hunted men for money. He rode out of the dragoons, leaving the past behind. He never went to Prescott. He never sought out Lina. Their paths had crossed in fire and violence, and that was where they would remain. He was a pathfinder, a man of the trail, and the trail always moved forward. He rode on, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent landscape, the land the same, the hero forever changed.